just to give an overview then, this is about the overall oil and gas industry and the way goods and services are procured and how contracting issues are thought about. At the end of this lecture, there'll be an assignment where each of the students are broken up into one of two groups to look at the procurement strategy and company strategies that would affect procurement. So be thinking about some of the issues we go through here. The purpose of this module is to specifically talk about the acquisition of goods and services highlighted in green here on this slide, where the bulk of the expenditure actually happens in the development and operational phases. I'm showing you with my pointer there where that bulk of that expenditure is, and that's where the procurement of goods and services is really critical. Are there any questions there? Howla, do you have any questions? Howla, do you have any questions about what we're going to cover?
Just to say that in mergers and acquisitions, there will be some kind of due diligence that will be carried out. Will that be part of the things we are going to cover in this course?
No, so anything to do with the acquisition or disposal of an asset wouldn't be covered, other than if there are existing contracts, then it may be that in the acquisition or divestment process, a lawyer may want to look at the existing contracts, but we won't be specifically covering that here.
Thank you.
So just to re-emphasize here that the bulk of the expenditure is in the development phase, shown in the purple bars here that go below this magic zero line. And then when the revenue starts, you move into an operations phase where the expenditure is much less, but the revenue amounts are much higher. And so this is where the procurement and services contracts are really very important in this phase here. And some of the contracts will be let, which have an effect for many years down the road. Another graph of the same thing, different kinds of recovery. Hopefully some of you will have covered this in other modules within the program. But there's the development phase here where production is building up, then it goes on plateau for a period of time, and then there's decline depending on the type of recovery mechanisms that are used to manage the reservoirs.
How long can each phase last? Do you know? Well, estimate?
The development phase in onshore developments like we have in Uganda and Kenya would last 2 to 3 to 4 years. The plateau phase is generally between 3 and 6 years. And then the decline phase, depending on the type of reservoir, could go on for maybe another 10 to 20 years. So in total, should be looking at about a 30-year time frame in here.
Thank you.
One of the important issues that everyone needs to be aware of when they're procuring goods and services is the oil price, because what largely drives the profitability and revenue for any asset. And what I want to point out here is the volatility of oil prices. Generally, in the world, we benchmark against Brent oil prices, which is the solid black line. And you can see if you go back 20 years, the oil prices fluctuated between a low of $10 a barrel in here and a high of $145 here, and jumps around a lot. And as you can see, this makes it very unpredictable what oil price to use. And most companies will be using an oil price, flat oil price in the range today of between $60 and $70 a barrel. Even though in history you can see that that's probably not the outcome we're going to have for oil prices. So when you're procuring goods and services, you need to keep in mind that some people will be using a different oil price assumption than you'll be using. And particularly suppliers are quite prone to being squeezed when prices go down. So we need to think about that in the contracting processes. And when prices are high, the suppliers are going to be looking to have more profitability. So depending on where you are in the price cycle, if you're contracting back in here in the low price, you're going to find that the suppliers are not going to be very profitable because the operators aren't profitable. If you're contracting in here, everybody thinking that they're going to be making a lot of money.
Greg, I have a question.
Okay.
What are some of the key factors that do influence oil pricing?
Well, that's a good question. Nobody has the answer to that other than OPEC is important, the oil producing and exporting countries led by Saudi Arabia, who try and manage the price. The other thing is geopolitical things like wars in Iran. This sanctions in Iran right now, for example, are causing oil prices to be managed. Let's say it's not clear what the effect of a lot of these actions are having, however. So this is a very unpredictable art. And my old boss used to say that when people asked him what the price of oil was going to be in the future, he'd say, well, it's going to go up and it's going to go down. I just can't tell you which order. So you need to use something conservative to make sure that you don't assume too much revenue. But if you're too low, then you're going to find that there's not going to be many people interested in working with you. The other point I want to make here is that refining generally is not a hugely capital intensive industry nowadays, because most refineries that exist can be expanded quite easily. And so there's not very much investment in the refining industry compared to those numbers on the upstream, where it's between $500 and $800 billion. You can see in the refining industry, we're talking numbers between 35 and $45 billion. Here is national oil companies do tend to have a different perspective on what they think about when it comes to procuring goods and services. So, for example, you have the big international oil companies who tend to procure globally. You then have the mid-cap companies like Tullow and Premier, some of you may have heard of them, who procure on a more regional basis, who are much more interested in project-specific procurement. And then you have the national oil companies like Aramco in Saudi Arabia, who insist on using a lot of local suppliers, but they also have a preference to award contracts to them, even though sometimes they may not be the best quality of contractor. They tend to get preferential treatment. So just a question for students, one of the things that's important is to think about what do you think the procurement strategy would be for the Uganda National Oil Company or the Kenya National Oil Company. Any thoughts about that? Well, some people, what do you think they're going to be worried about? You're on mute, Nolan.
For Uganda, it's basically the geopolitics.
So when they're procuring goods and services, what do you think that they're going to be pushing the contracting, the Tullows of the world and Total to?
I may respond, sir. In Uganda, there are policies now which are emphasizing local content. And they would really want that a certain amount of procurement that is done in the oil sector, which is still being discussed, significantly should be from Uganda. So I don't know, the percentage might range from 20 to 40. It's almost 50 even. It should be local content. This is what obtains.
And what do you think the implications of that will be for the contractors if they're being pressured to hire local firms? What do you think the consequences of that will be?
I think the biggest implication is in the quality of goods, of services that would be offered by these contractors. Since Uganda doesn't have a history of oil exploration, and therefore the local content providers are not as experienced in that area.
So these are some of the issues to think about as in the procurement strategy. I'm going to ask each of you to be making some proposals in this area. What's the strength of the procuring company? That is either Tullow or Total. What is the local capability in the market? Renee mentioned this. How long a contract are you getting? Is it like a 1-year construction project, or is it a 20-year maintenance contract? What's the international market look like? Here's one example where the construction of floating production, storage, and offloading facilities, which is what an FPSO is, the end of this coming week, I'd expect each of you to give me a 4 to 5 page paper covering these 4 issues. In your own words, describe what the company strategy is, what the impact of that strategy is on procurement and contracting, particularly because of the importance of drilling. Think about what the issues will be for drilling contractors who get a contract to drill either 400 wells in Uganda or 200 wells in northern Kenya. And then you pretend you're the head of procurement for the company. What are the key issues that you would advise your management about your procurement strategy? Any questions?
Yeah, I have 2.
Okay.
In the geopolitics of oil and gas procurement, what will Uganda's biggest challenge be? What do you think it will be?
Well, I think 2 things. One is that attracting companies to move to Uganda, which is a landlocked country with no other oil and gas industry, it's going to be very important to get contractors who have the balance sheet, I call it, the size and the money in the bank account to be able to handle the ups and downs of being remote from the main markets in the world. And the other thing that's going to be very important is the logistics. Getting equipment, say from Korea or Japan,